Hey gang, welcome back to another video. So this week I'm doing something a little bit different, and I'm going to attempt to crank out a one-of-a-kind Star Wars themed ornament in under 24 hours for this year's Ord-ament Project auction, with all the proceeds going to the Startlight Children's Foundation. Now mine will be one of over 60 ornaments created by makers in the Star Wars community, so I'm going to have to bring my A game. So let's get into it. To kick off this project, I was provided with a base design that I slightly modified in Illustrator to help add a bit more of the Bouche character details, which I then cut from 1/8 inch MDF on my laser cutter. Once I had all the pieces cut, I laid them out on my work surface and decided on my paint colors. I had a few reference photos I was working from that I thought would help guide my decision making, and so everything got labeled, and then I sealed it all with a bit of Satin Clear coat off camera and let it dry. When the clear coat had dried, I could get to laying down the first color for this backing plate, which was a rust oxide color, and would be the base for any additional layers of paint that would represent the overall color of Leia's helmet. I followed up with a medium brown and tried to keep it as organic as possible while still allowing the base color to bleed through. I was just looking to make this as interesting as possible, knowing that most of it would be covered up by additional pieces of MDF. And when I felt like I had good coverage, I set those pieces aside and grabbed the center symbol, which I painted in this warm brownish-orange color to represent the snout part of the helmet. I'd thought about covering this in leather, but decided that this was the best way to approach it. With the Rebel symbol painted, I could switch back to the previous pieces and apply a darker reddish-brown to warm it up a bit and to give it a bit more of a dingy appearance. I clearly should have used some tape to hold these smaller pieces in place, but I wasn't really worried since I wanted these to look a bit banged up. I ended up using a wet towel to make them even more blotchy, just to really give these parts some character. Once the Rebel symbol was dry, I could use some of that same reddish brown to shade the edges to make it a bit more dimensional. I really should have dropped the PSI in my air compressor so that I wasn't chasing all of these parts around, but I knew everything would get weathered in the end, so I didn't bother. And speaking of weathering, I grabbed that same wet towel again and blotted some of the paint away from the edges to break it up a bit, which helped to hide some of the areas where I went a bit too heavy with paint. It wasn't my intention, but definitely worked out in my favor. Once all of the parts were dry, I gave them a quick coat of Satin Clear to lock in my colors and could shift my attention to the final element on the front side of the ornament. This ring got a quick coat of gray spray paint, and then I could move on to the back panel. I wanted this piece to have some texture, kind of like the suede material in the Bouche costume. So I grabbed some spray adhesive and applied it to both sides. This would give me a fine, consistent texture across the entire plate, which should look nice once it's painted. When the spray adhesive dried, I grabbed this Sahara beige color and coated the entire part, and then set it to dry and shifted my attention back to the front elements. When I laser cut these parts, I included guidelines, but those quickly disappeared after the clear coat and paint layers, so I decided to just flip the gray ring over, apply a bit of glue, and center up the main part, knowing that the 3 smaller pieces would be easier to apply once it was in position. So when the main piece had dried, I could flip it back over and just eyeball the position of the smaller parts and got them glued in one by one. The last thing to do was to add on the Rebel symbol, and that got centered up and glued into position. For the backside of the ornament, I wanted to have a few more helmet references, and I used this ring, which I'm painting a gloss black, to include those details, like the numbers 1138 from the right side of the helmet and the 8 stripes from the left. While I waited for the gloss black to dry, I decided to add some chipping to the front piece with a silver Sharpie. This is the fastest way to add some character to a prop, and while it's not dimensional like using masking fluid, it is a lot faster and still looks the part. Now before I could glue this to the backing plate, I needed to fill in the area behind the 4 pill-shaped openings with a bit of gray, just like on the helmet. So I eyeballed the location, and then once I saw it was the right spot, I added a bit more paint to make sure the coverage was even, and then I could get to gluing it all together. I wanted to make sure that the bond here was good, so I scratched away at the paint and texture layers until I saw bare MDF, and then I could add a few drops of CA glue and bond the pieces together. The following morning, I could get to painting the main element for side 2 of the ornament, the thermal detonator. This was 3D printed in resin, coated in one layer of filler primer, and then buffed with an extra fine steel wool pad and painted with a gloss black spray paint and set aside to dry. I also painted up these small studs, which is a nod to the gloves that Leia wore while in the Bouche outfit, which also got painted gloss black. When the thermal detonator and the studs were dry, I moved into the shade and applied a high gloss clear coat to everything. This is one of those steps that can make or break a finish, but if you get it right, or in my case, pretty close, it really makes the metallic paint look real. The one thing that you really want to avoid, though, is applying it too heavily, which I did in a few spots, but thankfully it will be hidden by the gloss black ring. After about 20 minutes, the gloss coat was dry and I could get to applying the metallic paint. I'm using a Lumiluster for this since it's easy to apply, and an added bonus Star Wars tie-in, it's the same paint used for the Mandalorian's armor. This layer gets applied at about 25 psi and can be buffed once it's dry to really make it shine. With the paint dry, I could get to adding in the switch, which took a bit of force to get it into position, and then I can drop in a red light cover to finish the look. Now that all the parts are painted, I could get to gluing everything in place on the back side of the ornament. I didn't bother to scrape the paint on this side like I did with the front, since I applied an obscene amount of glue to the thermal detonator and studs, so they're not going anywhere. And once they were dry, I could grab some oil paint and a brush and do a bit of final weathering to everything except for the detonator, since I figured the shine would bounce the lights from the Christmas tree. I wasn't looking to go too crazy since I was happy with the colors and textures that I was able to achieve from the initial passes of paint, but I still wanted to give it a little bit of grime. And when I was happy with how things looked, I could call this finished, and it was time to pack it up and send it to Mike at Hondo Supply to be photographed and placed up for auction to support the Starlight Children's Foundation. Now, if you're interested in bidding on this piece or any of the over 60 amazing pieces created by my fellow Star Wars prop makers and fans, be sure to follow at Hondo Supply on Instagram for all of the details. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, but most importantly, go make something.